I'm not sure that Real ID was actually well intended. But let's assume that it was. It is, I think, useless, and it's fair to say that unfortunately the 9/11 attacks caused U.S. public policy to launch 1,000 security ships, and many of them do not have a destination. They don't work. They don't provide cost-effective security, and they should be brought back to port. It's the time now with 911 far enough in hindsight to analyze what programs actually provide security and do so in a cost-effective way so that they don't make us worse off by, for example, spending $3 billion to avoid $1 billion in societal losses. That's a net loss to the society. So not all security is beneficial. Security can cost more than it provides in benefits. I'll start with a little bit of history of Real ID. And a lot of folks, would start the history with 911 and the 9/11 Commission. But the history goes a little further back. As early as 1939, the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, which is the umbrella group for driver licensing bureaus across the country, was advocating for increased licensing, increased testing of drivers in order to build the revenue stream for driver licensing bureaus. The organization has been there at every turn in society looking to increase the role of driver's licenses and government-issued IDs in our society. In 1956, AMVA put out a document urging people to remember that driving should be thought of as a privilege and not a right. It really wanted to fight against the notion that Americans should have a right to drive in the United States. Rather, it's a government-granted privilege. That's what allows states to maintain driver licensing bureaus. Obviously, we don't want the streets to be a free-for-all, but driver licensing is only one way of causing drivers to be secure vis-a-vis one another. AMVA's been there all the way. The old saying, if what you have is a hammer, every problem is a nail. Well, AMVA has a national ID, and every problem is, I've just failed with the metaphor. But you get what I'm saying. This has been something that this organization and driver licensing bureaus have been working on for a long time. But obviously, the most recent iteration of the debate starts with the 9/11 attacks and counterterrorism. It's often cited, the Real ID Act, as a recommendation of the 911 Commission. In part, I suppose, but in large part not. The 911 Commission dedicated about 3/4 of a page out of three or 400 pages of substantive material to the question of identification and licensing. And it recommended that the federal government should set standards for birth certificates and driver's licenses. The 911 Commission did not articulate how that would actually secure, how it would have prevented 911 had Real ID been in place ahead of time or any other kind of national ID system. It didn't articulate certainly how it would cost effectively prevent terrorist attacks or provide any kind of security. And Real ID wasn't the law passed in response to the 911 Commission. In fact, prior to the passage of Real ID, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act contained provisions that dealt with state driver licensing and identification policy. At the time the Real ID Act was passed, a negotiated rulemaking had begun. That is, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Transportation, state driver licensing officials, and a variety of other groups, including privacy groups, getting together to discuss how this could be done well. Passage of the Real ID Act canceled that negotiating rulemaking process in favor of a top-down prescription from Washington about how states were supposed to conduct their licensing and the issuance of their IDs. In brief, there are nearly 100 requirements in the Real ID Act, and most of you have on your chair a blog post I put up this morning that articulates them. And the hook that Real ID has, because the federal government cannot commandeer the states, is that the federal government would refuse to accept IDs from states that are not compliant with the Real ID Act. And that's been sort of at the center of the debate ever since, and it's something I'll talk about more toward the end. As Peter mentioned, Real ID passed without a hearing and without an up or down vote in the Senate. It shows frankly, and a bill was introduced this week to amend Real ID, to tweak it a little bit because some of the things weren't considered about the licensing processes and ID processes in some of the U.S. territories, not thought through, but lots else wasn't thought through. When it passed in May of 2005, it set a 3-year deadline for states to comply. That is, states were to start issuing licenses subject to federal standards within 3 years. It took the Department of Homeland Security almost 3 years to issue the regulations that would tell states what to do. It was January of 2008, just 4 months before the compliance deadline, the DHS came out with the regs telling states what they should do. Naturally, for the first time of many, the DHS pushed the deadline back, gave blanket extensions to everybody, and started a complicated, multiplicitous process that continues today, where they told states, okay, you don't have to comply. We'll let you go a little bit longer if you declare this allegiance to the Real ID Act, et cetera, et cetera. Even a brief version of the story is in a paper from May 2014 called Real ID, a state-by-state update. You can look for that online. At the time the regs were finalized, DHS itself estimated $17 billion in implementation costs. But by that time, the states had already started to look at Real ID, and in 2006, about a year after the law was passed, when they're starting to focus on what was involved, a thing got started that I like to call the Real ID Rebellion. States across the country, Northeast, Northwest, Southern states, Midwestern states, red and blue states, started bridling at what they anticipated if they were to comply with Real ID. The cost and the privacy consequences to their residents was what caused their objections. And again, like I said, across the country, more than half the states in the country passed either resolutions inviting their federal representatives to revisit Real ID, or bills barring the state entirely from complying with the Real ID Act. So there's still many states that are statutorily barred in their own law from complying with Real ID. Before I get back to the history, what's happened since then, I want to go into identity-based security. And actually, it's kind of an interesting thing about Real ID. The merits of a national ID are very rarely discussed. But obviously, that's the essence. And I suppose one of the reasons why the Real ID Act and the national ID idea has a lot of currency is because people assume that it provides security benefits that make it somewhat worth the cost. I've written a book on identity that is kind of interesting. A predecessor of Peter's used to characterize this as one of the least bad policy books he'd ever read, and I take that as a very, very high compliment. But Identity Crisis, How Identification is Overused and Misunderstood was my exploration into how identity systems work, and knowing that, you can determine how they fail. Obviously, identity is essential. Think of it as sort of an economic and social glue. We use identification all the time to recognize our loved ones, to communicate with people. It's absolutely essential, and there's obviously no getting rid of identity. It works very well in common interactions in our ordinary day-to-day society. Just to illustrate, and this may be why people assume so readily that a national ID provides security. If I were to borrow your phone, you could be relatively confident of getting it back because you know my name, you know who I am, you know where I work, you could find me. You could call my friends, you could call the police if you needed to get your phone back. Anticipating that, if I'm not just a nice guy, anticipating that, I'm going to go ahead and give you your phone back because it's going to be more hassle than it's worth because you'll come after me and get the phone. So knowing who I am means that I behave well with respect to you. That's the benefit of identification in day-to-day interaction, and it works. So there's no denying that identity is beneficial. It's essential, in fact. But what if you're dealing with someone who we'll call a motivated attacker? It could be a criminal or a criminal syndicate. It could be a terrorist. It could be someone who lacks impulse control. You don't get the same benefit from identification vis-a-vis those people. They may identify themselves to you directly and still do a bad thing to you, someone with impulse control, a terrorist. And indeed, on 911, the terrorists identified themselves accurately. It's sort of a myth that hangs out there that they used a lot of identity fraud in order to ply their trade or make their way through the country. They identified themselves accurately. They used minor identity frauds. I think in Virginia, a few of them claimed state residency when they'd been in the state less than 5 days, which was fraudulent, but it's one of the most minor frauds I could possibly think of. Identifying themselves accurately, they went ahead and committed their dastardly deeds. Other malefactors will try to defeat your identity system, so a criminal syndicate or something like that. And it's really not that hard to do, particularly in the example of terrorism, because there's sort of two ways to avoid the security of an identity system. I call them logical avoidance and physical avoidance. Logical avoidance is getting the ID that's necessary to access whatever infrastructure is controlled by ID. So it's using the ID that's required, getting an ID if you really need to, getting a fake ID. It's really not that hard, and especially if you're a motivated attacker, it's not at all hard to get the documents to put together an identity. Now, there are definitely efforts to strengthen the license and make it harder to do that, but just how much are you going to expend of society's resources and the time and effort of every American to make it hard to get a fake ID so that some bad actor can't get a fake ID? Because in addition to logical avoidance of an ID security system, there's physical avoidance. That's literally going someplace that's not controlled by identification. So if I am trying to, I'm sorry to always be talking about terrorist dangers, but they're one of the prime motivators for this. So if I am unable to access planes for some reason, I go to a shopping mall. We saw this tragically demonstrated in Paris. They went to a place, they were obviously in places that it doesn't require identification to go there. And so they're able to do damage without regard to the fact that France is a national ID country. They have a national ID. It's optional, but customarily people carry their IDs with them at all times, and they're required by law to show ID when they're asked for it by police or other judicial authorities. So here you've got an unfortunate example where the existence of an ID system did not provide any of the kind of security that we'd want and that we'd expect from a national ID. Physical avoidance, simply going places where an ID is not required. So that's the security question, which is the most important. I think that if there are privacy costs in addition to dollar costs that make a national ID very concerning, but if it provided good security, if it was a solid security system, I'd be hard pressed to say that we shouldn't have such a thing. I'm very bought into the standard of the Fourth Amendment, which is that people's privacy is protected against unreasonable searches and seizures. And if it is a reasonable security measure, it's something that I would probably be willing to embrace. So I'm not just standing here saying no to a national ID despite all. I'm saying no to a national ID because it doesn't add up in terms of cost and benefits. Well, since the Real ID rebellion in 2006, 2007, and 2008, the DHS has continually pushed back compliance deadlines. And that's an important theme for the current discussion of Real ID, because the DHS and its pro-national ID allies are very sort of urgently nowadays telling states that enforcement is about to come, that any time now the Department of Homeland Security is going to start refusing people's licenses if they're from a state that isn't compliant with Real ID. Basically what that boils down to is not being able to access DHS headquarters and some meetings that happen in Washington, D.C. That doesn't matter to most people in the United States. No offense, Washington, D.C. It also means access to federal facilities, and that's had some people concerned in some states like New Mexico, which has a lot of federal labs and that kind of thing. But the real kicker is the threat that the Transportation Security Administration might refuse the licenses of people who are from states that aren't complying with Real ID when they go to travel, when they go to visit grandma at Christmas time, or whatever the case may be. My contention, and it's based on experience and my assessment of the politics, is that the states are really in the driver's seat on this if they choose to be. Experience is that DHS has continually kicked down deadlines. It used to declare deadlines in the Federal Register and say, well, the deadline, we're going to change the deadline to this. And then a year later when that deadline was getting closer, they said, well, we're going to change the deadline to that. And a few years later when that deadline was getting close, they'd change the deadline again. A few years ago, they dropped out of doing that in the Federal Register and said, we're going to have a phased-in implementation period. And instead, they've been going around person to person and saying to state legislators, here's when your turn comes for us to come after you. And generally, these state legislators aren't paying attention to Jim Harper at the Cato Institute or haven't been able to find my stuff online. And they believe that that's the case. So they think that they've got to fall in line. But time and again, particularly in the early years, states that had barred themselves from complying with Real ID stared down the Homeland Security Secretary. And there are examples, South Carolina and Montana, a red state and a blue state, coincidentally, in terms of governorship. Those states had barred themselves from complying. And at one point, the DHS said, you can get an extension if you request one by a certain date. These governors declined to even request an extension because their states had barred themselves from complying. They couldn't, in good faith, say, I'd like an extension for a program that we have no plans to comply with. In the end, after vigorous stare down and exchange of letters and exchange of comments in the press, these state governors sent letters to the DHS Secretary Michael Chertoff stating what their states do in terms of identification security already. And Secretary Chertoff accepted that letter as a request for a deadline extension and granted it. Very fascinating. The governor of Montana said, I sent them a horse and they treated it like a zebra. And that's a fine thing to do. The reason why states are in the catbird seat here is because of, I think, how the politics play out. And I think the folks at DHS are pretty good at reading the practical politics of refusing people their right to travel when they go to the airport. On the day that TSA begins to implement, should it ever come, and I don't think it will, it would not be state legislators that people get angry at. It would not be governors that people write letters about. It would not be their Department of Motor Vehicles that shows up in the newspaper reports about what happened when a person couldn't get home, when a person couldn't get to visit their relative. It would be the TSA. And it would be Congress. And it would be the Department of Homeland Security that you hear about, blocking people from traveling because they don't come from a Real ID state or they don't carry a national ID card themselves. So I think the game here is for people like me to educate state leaders and people like you to educate your bosses here in Congress about what this policy is, how it works, and really how it fails. Right now, the push is on for Real ID compliance. I talked about how the Department of Homeland Security is speaking to states. State motor vehicle bureaucrats themselves have worked as sort of subtle allies of the DHS on this. They and the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators get together and they go to the legislators and they say, I think most of them may believe that this is true, and some of them may not, that we've really got to do this. We have to obey federal policy on this matter. And the state legislator, not knowing any better, dutifully introduces bills, and then they start to hear from their constituents. Then they start to hear from people like me. They start to hear from the ACLU. And many states turn around and stop compliance. And we may just continue talking about this with states like that. But the better approach, I think, would be for some change to the policy. I've talked a lot over many years about the fact that the Congress, the U.S. Congress, funds this dynamic by allowing money in the DHS appropriations bill to go into a grant fund that ultimately keeps a money flow going. So that the state motor vehicle bureaus, they see money coming, they can convince their legislators, hey, we get federal money if we do this. AMVA, the group that I talked about, they see this as an opportunity to make money, so they, as a special interest group, are going to keep working it. And that's because the money spigot is open. And I've argued that Congress should close the money spigot and stop funding a national ID system. It's one of the great policy options where you could save taxpayer dollars and make the country better off at the same time. Should a national ID be implemented, I think that you'd find quickly that not only would it harm the privacy of law-abiding citizens much more than it would provide any security, it would also be subject to mission creep. Let me go into each of those separately and just talk a little bit about the privacy consequences. When we use a variety of different means to identify ourselves, when there's no one standard for identification, that means it's a little bit more difficult to figure out who people are. It provides you privacy protection. If you've identified yourself to one person or one company or one group using one set of identification standards, the data that they accumulate about you isn't interoperable with another group's data. So I mean, for competitive reasons and probably data structure reasons, Google and Facebook could not quickly combine data that they have about all the people in the country because they're not using the same standards, and happily they don't want to combine this data. But let's say that every organization, every company used the same set of data standards to identify people. So they use the same. I won't get into the technology, the sort of, the data fields and all these things that are involved in cards like those required under the Real ID Act. But if everyone's using the same data standards, the data about you becomes interoperable. So the card swipe that you did at the entrance to the Rayburn building accumulates the same kind of data as the card swipe that you do when you go into the office building where your doctor's office is located. And as these data sets come together, they paint a more and more complete picture about your life. We're already moving very quickly, as you know, into a sort of surveillance society where lots of organizations of all types have lots of data about us. If we unify it all around one identity system, that hurdles us far faster and far further into a surveillance society. So, I mean, I think there are many benefits to technology, many benefits to being identified. But the last thing we need is a federal policy that drives us all into the same identity system so we can be identified uniquely by a variety of organizations that ultimately can share information about us and build these kinds of dossiers that are really allow intrusion into our lives. So that privacy dimension is important. And again, it's the privacy of law-abiding people. In a national ID system, the good people are the ones carrying the national ID. And the people who are trying to thwart may or may not be carrying a national ID, may or may not be carrying an ID that's accurate. Mission creep is very important to keep in mind. When you have ID systems that are diverse, there's not that much benefit to collecting identity for the organization, for the corporation, or for the government agency. If you have a system in place that makes it easy, it's going to happen more often. When you go to use a credit card, let's also get an ID swipe, just to add a little bit of security. When you go to pick up your prescription at the pharmacy, when you go to the doctor's office, say you want to buy a gun or ammunition, the list goes on and on. Financial services, housing, these are all things that have actually been proposed for a national ID system, including controlling access to voting. One of the dimensions that's important to consider about this is the use of facial recognition. The Real ID Act doesn't require facial recognition. The Real ID regulations lean in favor of facial recognition, and a number of states are using facial recognition on their driver license photos right now, thanks to the impetus given to that by the Real ID Act. If it's implemented nationwide, I think you should have little doubt that facial recognition will be broadly used by DMVs. And as the technology evolves, it'll be more often used by more and more entities. That surveillance society that we don't want to plunge ourselves into too quickly. So given the lacking benefits and giving these kinds of costs, in addition to the dollar cost of implementing, I think Real ID ends up being a loser. A well-intended but ultimately useless security program. Here's where the debate goes. The DHS has set out a number of deadlines for a variety of states, and there's a very interesting document that it has out called on the web called Real ID Enforcement in Brief. And on this web page, they list just 2 non-compliant states and territories, American Samoa and Minnesota. The suggestion here is that all the rest of the states are compliant. But if you look at the list and you look at the asterisk and the double asterisk and the pound sign next to more than half of the states that are in the compliant or extension states and territories, they're not compliant either. DHS is sort of trying to paint a picture of widespread compliance so that states that are hanging back feel like they're going to be left out in the cold. The accurate picture is that more than half of the states in the United States are not compliant, according to DHS's own webpage dealing with Real ID enforcement. And they're also mischaracterizing what compliance is on their website. When they say that states are compliant, they're referring to what's known as a material compliance checklist. This is a thing they came up with in 2007. Instead of real full enforcement with all the terms of the law, including the back-end information sharing, they said we're going to put together a material compliance checklist. And the states that promise to do this stuff, we're going to give extensions to. And it's, I don't know, by number, it's less than half of the requirements that exist in the Real ID law. So they're painting a picture of compliance. They're painting a picture of success, and I think that's to try to convince states that are hanging back that they need to get on board. The fact is that today most states are not complying with Real ID, and I don't think it'll be, I think it'll be a very long time before all states do. One reason for that, and it's a very good one, is that the back-end information sharing that states are required to do, the system for that hasn't been built yet. I don't think the system for that should be built. But it's important to know that one of Real ID's requirements is that every Department of Motor Vehicles that's compliant shares information with every other Department of Motor Vehicles across the country. So think about that in terms of data security. Okay? I'm running a motor vehicle bureau in my state, and I have to respond to any other state that pings me for data about Jim Harper. Jim Harper's data could go anywhere in the country and would be subject to the security success or failure of any other state. We see again and again in the private sector and the public sector where data is being breached, and this is a recipe for that kind of breach. You are opening up your data, if you're a state administrator, to every other state's security weaknesses. I think that some states in the very near future are going to move toward a two-tier licensing system. The Real ID Act allows for states to issue what they call non-federal licenses. They can be a compliant state if they issue federally compliant licenses and also non-compliant licenses. They don't have to require that, for example, proof of legal presence in the country. They can allow people a non-federal license if they don't want to show their green card or other proof of citizenship, proof of naturalization, et cetera, et cetera. That sounds like a good idea, and I think it's going to be an appealing compromise in a lot of states, that they'll have their official Real ID, it'll have a gold star on it, and then they'll have the non-federal license, which doesn't have the gold star and says not for federal purposes, and so on and so forth. I think what's important for those states to understand, and it's important for all of you to understand, is that to comply with Real ID, you've got to share back-end data about everybody. So I'm worried that these states are going to tell people you're not in the national ID system, you're not doing the federal ID, and then because of the terms of the Real ID Act, they're going to have to be sharing information about these very people who tried to opt out of that system. So that's something I'm going to be talking about a lot, and I think in the early part of next year, you'll see a lot of states, because of this pressure put on by DHS, moving to implement Real ID. A lot of hard questions. As they do implement Real ID, you can probably expect to get a lot of hard questions here, because in states that have moved early, Alabama was one, a lot of people got really upset because you have people, older people, people without a lot of money, people who live far away from a Department of Motor Vehicles, who go down to that office and they find out that they don't have the documents they need. Maybe their documentation was lost in a fire or a flood. They've been licensed their whole life, and they're getting called in again to prove that they're Americans and they're allowed to have a driver's license in the United States. So if the states go ahead and get on board with this, you're going to hear about it. If the DHS forgets about the politics and try to enforce this at the airport, you're going to hear about it too, because that would cause a real conflagration if the TSA starts to turn people away at the airports. Again, I think they probably won't.